Thanks very much, Pierre. We're fortunate indeed to have records in both words and pictures of the condition of the hardwood forests of southwestern Australia before the major periods of European exploitation. Here we have the case of Carrie, and if you focus in the foreground of the image over here, we love these projectors, the way they always shake around and show you what they've done the night before. This little object down in here is a horse. And whoever posed the picture obviously wanted to make a couple of points. First, the sheer size of the trees, and secondly, the open understory under a closed canopy. If we turn our attention now to Jarrah, we find a similar device being used. Down in the foreground here, you may pick up the head of the horse, rider there, horse over here, a rider again. And if we move across towards the left-hand side of the picture, you can see the logger perched on the bole of the tree, and we have a fairly clear idea of what's happening next. So a record of what was, and then what we did to it. In the first quote on this particular slide, we see from Wallace, conservator of forests, basically telling us that up to the watershed year, around 1920, you can see how much of that Jarrah forest had been cut over, how much timber had been removed, and an opening of the forest canopy. You can see in the photograph on the right-hand side, it's a photograph taken from Forest Department sources, used in a number of their publications to illustrate the consequences of unrestrained exploitation. Large timber removed, large amounts of logging slash left on the forest floor, wildfires of unbelievable intensity sweeping through, and great destruction of the forest. But 1920 in many ways represents a watershed because it is just into the formation of a Forests Department, began in 1918, the goal of which basically was to look after sections of the forest, to be tended as state forest, to be used for the production of timber in perpetuity. And as you can see in the quote from forest historian Williamson at the bottom of this particular slide, a very, very simple analogy for what they were setting out to do was to operate on the principle of forest capital and forest interest, where the interest is the growth of new timber on the forest estate, the capital, the original stand of timber, and the idea being, if you're operating sustainably, to cut within the interest. Certainly a simplistic point of view, but one that's readily understood, and again, dominated Forest Department literature. If we look at this particular slide, we get an idea of what it was that they actually had to contend with. If we focus first of all on the open black squares, give you an idea, that's the amount of Jarrah that was being removed from these areas over the periods indicated. And what we can certainly see is about the time of the foundation of the Forest Department. We can see that very, very large amounts of timber being removed. We can trace through social events, the Great Crash of the Great Depression, post-depression recovery, into the Second World War, post-war boom, and then a steady decline through the rest of the 20th century. So that's Jarrah. We can see equivalent figures for Carrie in the red diamonds across the bottom, not quite as emphatic in their representation of the social trends as Jarrah, but then some of the other interesting little things that are superimposed on here. Take the yellow stripes, for example, scattered through here. They represent the forest interest, to use Williamson's analogy. That was the increment rate of the forests over that period. That's all hardwoods. And if we look at the increment rate for Jarrah alone, we have some figures in some places that are given. These are blue circles. We can see in some cases the timber removed was underneath them. For a lot of that period, the increment rate wasn't matching the timber removed. And we can also see for Carrie, some situations also rather more similar, the timber removed against the cut. So social pressures, lots of things going on, very difficult for the forest managers. And we can look in their own words at the situations as they encountered it and as they struggled to work with it. From Lane Poole in 1920, then Conservator of Forests. From his successor, Kessel, in 1928. Kessel again in 1929. In 1935, after they'd been dealt the fortuitous hand of the Great Depression, which certainly helped in curbing some of the demand for timber. And fairly significantly within this quote is something that recurs quite frequently. In 10 years' time, we're going to get there. We're not there now, we're working for it. In 10 years' time, we're going to achieve it. Well, they probably did. And that 10-year cycle would have coincided, of course, with the Second World War. And probably by the time that they got there, they actually had, by their own figures, pretty much got the management right. But social pressures come into play again, the post-war boom, and as you can see here, in consequence of that, considerable pressure. Again, a conservator of forests, Stoat, responsible for that quote, he lost his job. And by 1956, as you can see in this particular quote, strong ideas that, yes, the forests could cope with the volume of timber that was being removed, and that we had the plans in place to be able to keep the basic amount of timber removed within the increment of the forest. Note in particular the emphasis on the mills in relation to this, migration of the timber industry, the number of sawmills, the emphasis that we're now moving into a period of industry stability. Optimistic? What happened? In this particular graph, you can actually see the number of mills of various sizes that have operated in southwest forests of Western Australia through that period through the second half of the 19th century and through most of the 20th century. And what we can see is a pattern that very much follows over-exploitation of a resource, with a rapid increase in the number of mills, a peaking, and then a decline. And as we move into the decline, you can notice also an increasing predominance of large mills relative to small ones. By the time we move up to 1974, we've got other figures that are available to us. These ones come from Hansard, from an exchange in the State Parliament, and they're focusing basically on the amount of timber being removed. The two principal hardwood species, the jarrah on the left here, and as you can see how much was taken, what the increment was, and the disparity. And then similar figures on the right-hand side of the slide, tracing the situation for carry. Still, despite all that optimism and all that effort, social pressure and far more timber being taken than was grown on the forested estates. Moving on into the 1990s, the Commonwealth now starts to get involved, the Resource Assessment Commission. And here from the Resource Assessment Commission itself, you can see their particular view on the problems confronting the management of the hardwood forests. We then have a look at the MAR report, basically looking at sustainable timber cut in Western Australia. And the interesting thing that comes out of this is that we see a recurring pattern that basically has sat across forest management pretty much for its history in Western Australia. What they believe is the sustainable figure, how much we could take, and in about 10 years we'll be able to get it right. We've seen it before, we see it again. Social pressure will take more than is sustainable, but in 10 years we're going to get it right. Why is this happening? Well, certainly not the fault of the managing profession. We've seen examples of the social and economic pressures that were on them. And in uncertain times, there's been a tendency to run down the old railway tracks and do exactly what's been done before. But full sustainability isn't just about a yield of timber. There are many other things as well: economic, environmental, social. And it's in this particular context that as we look ahead to a new forest management plan, we need to recognise the limitations of what we're actually facing. And also that these are forests that have taken a hammering for a substantial period of time. And there's a desperate need to preserve options into the future. And as we look at this next forest management plan, I do note and take great comfort in the fact that there will be external opinions taken with regard to setting the amount of timber that will be cut. I think that this is wonderful. very worthwhile, a great idea. I would also like to suggest that why don't we have this not just for the amount of timber taken, but for all the other aspects of a forest management plan, the social, the environmental, and not just the timber.
Thanks, Mike. We have some time for questions as we planned. Would anybody like to open the questions? Yes, sir.
Mike, thank you for that. In the context of sustainable forest management, which I believe is the overall goal, the exploitation in its current form, because Aboriginals of course exploited the forest, but they did it in a harvesting of from trees rather than a harvesting of trees form. I think that's very important to recognise. In terms of sustainability, the exploitative practices over the last, say, 200 years, or however long they've been, from an economic point of view, in my opinion, mean that for us to have sustainable forest management now and in the future, the environmental considerations in particular must be the prime concern, and the economic ones have already had their run and need to be put back in their box. Would you like to comment on that?
It's a view that I certainly share. When we're talking about sustainability, perhaps it's also important, rather than just to throw it around as a common use currency, perhaps we also need to be very, very clear what we're sustaining, over what time period, for whose benefit, and at whose cost. And I think in your comments you're suggesting that we have sustained an economic prosperity and a well-being for the best part of 200 years, but we've lost on other things. And I think share your position, which is that we should be shifting that now, and we should be focusing on the environmental side of our forest management and seeking to sustain that over an extended period.
Mike, would it be true to say that the increment figures are worse than they actually appear? Because some of that increment will be tied up in small trees. It will take a long time to produce useful timber.
You could well be right with that one, Jonathan. I think with the increment figures, it's very, very important to acknowledge that the reason why they were so spotty through all my graphs is that's exactly what the historical record gives us. And it's also true that the methods that are available to estimate increments have changed vastly over time. So the area of the forest estate has been changing. State forest hasn't been constant. The areas have been varying considerably with time. The methods that have been used to assess the increments are certainly changing with time. But I think to pick up on your point, if I understand the goal of an ongoing timber industry, it's basically to cut trees as they hit maturity. So you've always got trees growing to maturity to produce the largest volume of wood. And as a result of that, over time, you definitely alter the age structure of the forest to a much younger one. So I think your point is correct.
Yeah, thanks for that. Seems to be a recurring theme in the presentation that the solution is going to be found 10 years after you make a decision and thereafter.
Yes.
And I note that 7 points well articulated at the start, the basis of a scientific analysis. In the context of the reality of climate change, is there a suggestion that the perpetrators of these plans are going to once again apply themselves to a harvesting regime with the inclusion of environmental and other economic factors, but for the purpose of perhaps reviewing it in a further 10 years?
Without seeing the final document, I can't actually give a judgment on that. What I can say is that the actual amount of timber taken is, to my understanding, the only element of the plan where external experts have been brought in to give an assessment using the latest techniques, so as thorough, as independent as one could get. Now, of course, the answer that they arrive at will also be dependent on the quality of the information that they've been given to enter into their models. So whether they attempt to arrive at a figure that allows for change of rainfall, climate change, etc., we'll need to wait and see. They certainly have the resources available to do it, and certainly the expertise to do it, and they're certainly independent of the local pressures.
And in fact, I think we'll hear more about that certainly from Grant and perhaps from Mark as well as we go on. So maybe we can come back to that at the end if you feel as though there is still...
Not a problem, it seems to be an obstacle.
We have one more question.
Mike, you focused on the overcutting of the mature forest, but I think the issue really of sustainability is you have to recognise that of that over-exploited forest, you have now an overabundance of regrowth forest, and it's the sustainability of that regrowth forest which is now threatened by a reducing climate change, the reduced amenity, and it's the thinning of that overstocked regrowth forest is the thing that is really pressing the issue, not the question of the old growth forest. Would you comment on that, please?
I take two comments to that. The first one is that there are many within the scientific community who share your view that it is important to thin to ensure that we keep a forest in a number of areas in the face of climate change. So that, of course, requires the forest industry to go through that process of thinning. I think that that's a view that many people share. We may hear more about it from Grant and Mark later, but yes, there are certainly many who share that view. The separate question about what one does with what's left of large old stands of forest, I think is a separate and important question. If we look back to some of the very, very early State Forest Department documents, there is actually calls in there for the preservation of some of those large old stands so that people can remember and experience what the forests were before the changes that were inevitable in association with change to a production forest. So I see that as the second side to what you're talking about. Yes, thinning of regrowth, following through with proper silvicultural prescriptions, but together with that also perhaps to fulfil the wishes of those early pioneers who also wanted to keep some of the big, tall, old forest for posterity.
That's fabulous. Thanks, Mike.